Howdy, Ags, and welcome back to On Air with Student Affairs, the podcast the division created to show you all the programs and services that we offer here at Texas A&M and ways that you can create your Aggie experience. My name is Morgan Miles, and I'm the host of this podcast, and I am the loudest and proudest member of the Fighting Texas Aggie class of 2026, AAA. Woo! And today, we're talking about hazing because it is National Hazing Prevention Week. So I'm here with Dr. Bell and Dr. Harrell. How are y'all today?
Good. How you doing?
Doing well.
Good. So to start off, let's talk about your roles in the division. So could you tell me what you do here?
Well, howdy. My name is Dr. Douglas Bell. I serve as the Director of Student Community Standards. My office, my department is responsible for the investigation process, adjudication process of both individual and organizational student conduct cases.
And howdy, I'm Dr. Kristen Harrell. I serve as an Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs. There are a number of roles that I have, but some of the ones that are most applicable to this is I serve as the chair of the University Disciplinary Appeals Panel, so when things get to a level of suspension or expulsion. And then I also serve as a chair of the university's Rules and Regulations Committee, which looks at the student rules.
Awesome. So what is hazing? And can you give us a few examples of what that might look like?
Sure. Well, I'll start with that. Hazing really has a wide range of definitions. So similar to a number of different types of policies that we have, different jurisdictions are going to define things a little bit differently. And so when you look at the Texas Education Code, there's some specific language in there in terms of what is considered hazing. And so we have mirrored that language in our student rules. And so if you look at our student rule, that section, and it's going to fall under organization, affiliation, misconduct. And basically what that means is that the hazing behavior happens in the context of a student organization when there's some kind of affiliation. So it's I want to be a member of, I want to be affiliated with. And then under that are two different levels, and one of those is hazing. And that has a lot to do with physical harm that might happen. There's some pieces of risk in there that are involved. And then within that broader policy is also organization-related intimidation and or abuse. And those are some other behaviors that we might see, blindfolding, some of those kinds of things that kind of fall into this global idea of what hazing is. And so for different students, their national organizations may call something hazing that we are calling organization-related intimidation and or abuse. And the same thing, the federal government right now, the Congress has actually put a bill through, and they have a separate definition of what hazing is. And so it's really important, I think, for students and other folks to really look at what the jurisdictional language is pertaining to hazing and how that is defined in that particular space.
Right.
And there are several different examples of what we've seen here at Texas A&M as it relates to hazing. And I think some of the times, people are fully aware of like the most extreme cases of like physical abuse, right, or forced alcohol consumption or consumption of foods that are not healthy for you that induces vomiting and stuff like that. So those are some of the like easily spotting. I could see that that's hazing, but then there are some behaviors that can be seen as hazing that are not so overt. Some of those could be seen as like making somebody stay up till 3 or 4 in the morning when they typically need so many hours of rest before class. If you got an 8 o'clock class and you stay up until 3 o'clock in the morning, that can be
right,
a little tricky. Making somebody or forcing a new member to pick you up or drop you off at certain times of night. Some of that servitude can be seen as hazing. I think there, like I said, is very much a continuum as it relates to that, and we have some of that on our resources as it relates to like the continuum on our website, Stop Hazing. But one of the things I think students really have where it challenges students to really think about hazing is really thinking about how that power structure and how somebody who is active or upperclassman or somebody who is of a position of power forcing or requiring some behavior of a student that may not be like in a normal course of the activities of that particular organization is kind of where those examples of hazing kind of show up.
Yeah, and I would add too that typically speaking, a red flag is when some kind of activity has nothing to do with the purpose of the organization. So we usually have students kind of ask the question of like, does this resonate with the values of the organization? Does it match the mission and vision of this organization? And if it's stepping outside of that, that starts to be a red flag of what is the purpose behind this, and really what is the reason why we're doing a particular activity within the context of that organization.
Right. So are there any examples of things that you guys see that people can mistake for hazing that are actually not hazing?
I think one of the things that has always been an example that people bring up is like making a new member do community service. But if your organization is community service based, then it kind of makes sense to require so many hours of community service. Or I think one of the requiring an individual to know information about that organization's history. Yes, I think that makes sense to make sure that somebody understands the history. I think where it skirts into hazing is when if they get it wrong, then there's some sort of punishment or repercussion is where it gets skirted into it, where it can go into the hazing land. But just making somebody know the information about an organization's history is not considered hazing.
Yeah, I think the other thing, too, is that sometimes students do fence looking. So they look at a different organization. They're like, but they're doing that thing. And we're like, yes. Yeah. That is because that is in direct alignment with the purpose of that organization. Exactly. So one of the pieces in there is kind of physical abuse. And we see that sometimes in physical exercises. Well, there are certain organizations where doing physical training is appropriate. Right. And there are other organizations where doing physical training has nothing to do with anything that they're doing. It's like, no. Yeah. That's crossing the line. And so that's where sometimes, too, I think that there's a little bit of a blurred understanding of what is and what is not, but it's within context. And all of that really matters when we're talking about hazing behavior.
Yeah. I'd like to ask a question because I feel like this is something that's like widely believed, I feel like, by students. So is it hazing even if you consent to the behavior that's like being performed or that you're required to do?
No. Just because you consent to it, excuse me, doesn't mean that it's that there's no way I could be hazed because I agreed to this activity. Because of the power dynamic, sometimes individuals or students will be not coaxed, but their need to want to be a part of an organization and the desire to be a part of such an organization, they are willing to do whatever that organization wants them to perform. So they'll say, I wanted to do this because I wanted to be a part of XYZ organization. But just because of that doesn't mean that hazing behavior did not occur. So that's kind of how we kind of frame it whenever we have conversations with students.
Yeah, and I think the other dynamic of that we see when we look at the spectrum of things that may fall within hazing, kind of depending on which definition you're using, is this concept of foot in the door. So if I walked up to your room and just like walked in the room, you might have some feelings about that, right? But if I come and knock on the door and I'm standing outside the room and we're talking and then I just kind of like slide my foot. So you can't really shut the door and I'm still there, but I'm engaging you in conversation. And then I'm slowly, as we're having this conversation, moving towards you. General thing about personal space is we tend to back up when someone comes at us. Right. And then eventually I find my way into the room. And I've done that slowly and I've done that progressively. And that has allowed me to do something that initially you would have been like, get out. But because I've done that, and effectively I could say, you let me in here. I mean, you backed up and you gave me space to be able to walk into this space. But the reality is that I'm manipulating the situation to get us to an extreme. And so oftentimes we start at these really low-level behaviors that unfortunately escalate into what then becomes hazing. And so how do we make sure we're having that conversation early on and that we figure out where our boundaries are before we get to the point where I'm in the room?
So it's interesting that you said, like, the foot in the door. I love that example. I've never heard of that. So manipulation is a big part of hazing as well.
It can be. So it's not always, because the other thing too is folks who haze other people, right? One, I want to make it clear, and I think philosophically, as student community standards, is when somebody does something that violates the rules, they're not a bad person.
Right.
Right? Like, these are just behaviors that we want to address and make sure are not happening in our community. And I think, sometimes the word manipulation comes across as being a bad thing. We manipulate each other all of the time. And sometimes that's to good and sometimes that's to not so good. I think there is some level of that built growth, and I don't think people know that they're necessarily doing that because it's this pattern of behavior that's happening and is built into an organization. And so a lot of people who get to this crux of real harm that is happening in hazing situations, it's not just them, it's generations of people who came before them to get us to the point where that was going to happen. And I think the bigger piece that I personally look at when we look at hazing is power. Right. And so how does power get exerted? And maybe I experienced something that I felt a certain kind of way about, or I felt powerless in that situation. And then how do I turn that around when I become in the position of power? And then how do I execute that on then the people who are coming behind me? And that is some of what continues to grow in those situations.
Yeah. I think it's easy for people to sometimes haze others, I guess, because of it's just kind of like generational, kind of like you said, of like, oh, this happened to me. So like, I guess it kind of becomes not a big deal because it's like something that is like well known, like this is what has to happen to be in a certain organization or like program. And so it's easier to pass on to that next new member coming in. So what do you recommend for like new members whenever they identify that they're being hazed, or how can they identify that they're being hazed, and like what should they do and what is that next step moving forward?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways to kind of identify whether you're being hazed. One is like I think Dr. Harrell mentioned, is what I'm being asked to do in line with the mission, vision, and values of the organization. Two, does this activity cause me emotional risk or or physical risk of harm? I think those are some clear-cut things. I think some of the other ways for a student to really be able to identify is like if my mom or the media knew I was doing this, would they be in? Will they have a reaction? Mm-hmm. Then there's probably something that we really need to think about. And are you being told to keep this activity? Hey, don't tell anybody. Yes, they're going to be part of organizations' rituals that are in writing, tried and true. But if you're following the ritual, that's one thing. But if you're going coloring outside of and being asked to, hey, I'm taking you here, don't tell nobody. Yeah. Like then it's probably something that is a little that can be seen as hazing. And is it against our university policy or a law violation? If you're violating the law, 9 times out of 10 is some sort of hazing. If a video of this activity was posted online, how would people react? If you think people will react adversely to it, then it's probably some sort of hazing that may be occurring. So those are ways to identify it in students. But I think a lot of times, students are scared to even, once they have identified it, to report it. And that is one of the things that we're trying to really push during this Hazing Prevention Week is really to report. If you see it, if you're involved in it, please report it because we want to address it. We want to educate students on how to report it and also how we address it. Because I think, as Dr. Harrell says, that I think a lot of students feel like when they have to come to the student conduct office, it's gloom and doom, and we want to lay the hammer down on students. And really our goal is to educate students and really get them to understand, okay, if I'm faced with this same decision to go left or right, next time I'm going to make the right decision. So that's kind of our goal when we deal with students in our student conduct office and student community standards.
So I do want to touch back on something that you said. You talked a little bit about like social media. So referring to social media, like is it considered hazing if someone is like posting embarrassing pictures of somebody like without their consent? Because I feel like that's something that's also like super common. Like, is that considered hazing or not really?
Yeah, I mean, it can be considered hazing. It depends on what context it's in, but it's also a violation of our university rule. We have a rule that says you shouldn't be posting a picture of somebody without their consent. So if that individual knows that that picture is being posted without their consent, if they report it to our office, we would also address that outside of just hazing, but we would definitely also investigate that for hazing as well.
Yeah, and it may fall into that organization affiliation, intimidation, and harassment or abuse. Because also looking at the impacts of some of those things are pretty critical in terms of where that fits in.
Right. So I want to touch back also on the student conduct process. And you said a lot of times students think that it's doom and gloom and like, oh, I'm in so much trouble and like I'm going to get kicked out of A&M and like all these terrible things. So what does that process look like and how can it be beneficial for the students that are going through that process?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. A lot of times what happens is I think students think that we're out in the bushes trying to catch people get in trouble. That's kind of not our role in the student conduct office and student community standards. So what we do is we respond to reports that we get to our office. So if we get a report in and it kind of outlines some hazing behaviors, sometimes we'll investigate that, and we have a total separate staff that kind of deals with investigations. So it'll be a full-time investigator with a volunteer investigator. They'll call students in, ask them questions. Those individuals do not make any decisions. They just collect the information and write a report of kind of laying out the facts or what is reported, what happened, and then they give it to me to evaluate, make sure that everything looks okay. Then that information is passed on to the student conduct office. Our student conduct office then evaluates that for individual conduct allegations, charges, and then they send student notifications letters to let them know if there's any charges that are stemming from that investigation report. Then that investigation report is also forwarded to our organizational misconduct, so they can also evaluate it for any misconduct as it relates to the organization is concerned. And if they seem that there's some organizational misconduct, they'll also send a notification letter to that organization. What we do is we'll invite the students to come in and kind of have a conversation with us about that particular case, because we understand the report is just one side of the story. In order to get a full context of what exactly happened, we also invite the student to come in and kind of share their experience. After that conversation, if it seems like there's not enough information to move forward with an alleged violation, we'll tell the student there's not enough information here and you're not responsible for the violation. But if it seems like based on the information they provided and the information within the report that it's more likely than not that some misconduct occurred, then we'll find the student or organization in violation. And then we turn towards our sanctioning. And when we think about sanctioning, we're not here, like I said, to just throw the hammer down. 9 times out of 10, our goal is to educate to make sure they don't make the same decision twice. So depending on the severity of the behavior, one of the things we'll do is a primary sanction, which that may be probation, conduct review. If it's severe enough, it may lead to a suspension or expulsion, but that's like on the real extreme cases. But we'll look at some of that. Sometimes it's just a reprimand or a warning, let them students know. But one of the things that we always make sure that we have is some sort of educational sanction. And one of the things we offer as it relates to some of our hazing incidents is we have a hazing education workshop where we really kind of demystify all the information related to hazing. And then a lot of times when students come to that, they have a better understanding of why we applied our hazing policy the way we did, because they went through this workshop. And then there are also times after a hazing education workshop where a lot of those members or organizations like to make sure that we don't have this in the future. Can you come and talk to our organization? And we do have hazing prevention trainings that we actually offer organizations as well. So like I said, my goal is to never have a student come into our office because of this, because of the education that we offer. But we understand that students do make some decisions that may not be in line with that. So we try to make sure that our process is as educational as possible.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is that the staff really recognize like there's anxiety that comes with the potential that I might be in trouble, right?
Right.
And I think this kind of framework of understanding that the whole intention of the process is education. If there is a way, understanding that we might be feeling a certain kind of way of what it means to quote unquote be in trouble, and that's not really how we look at it. It really is about the decisions were made in a particular situation. Let's see if it's a violation or not. And then what can we learn from that situation? So how do we move forward from here? And I think sometimes people get into the anxiety of this is going to negatively impact my entire life. And really, ultimately, it is intended to help benefit students moving forward. And I know sometimes it doesn't feel like it, but we do. We have students who come out of that process and talk about what they've learned from that. I've even had somebody who was suspended who came back and said that was what I needed in my life to prioritize what I need to be doing to move forward in my future. And I think that's another piece of that component is how we frame that experience going through. And one of my favorite questions, and I've had situations where people didn't do anything, was a violation of a rule or that kind of thing, but it's, what could you have done differently in this situation that would have had a different outcome? It's not placing value on the decision that was made. It's just saying, what was the outcome of that decision and how could we get somewhere else?
Right. So I kind of have two questions that I want to tie in together. And so how we talked about how it's important to like report hazing and like come to student community standards if you've experienced hazing or if you know someone that's experienced it. But I think it's also, like you said, there's a lot of anxiety that comes with it. Is it right to report it to, like, let's say, like the president or whoever is the leader of your chapter or whatever you're involved in, and then go to student community standards? Or should you go to student community standards first? Because I think sometimes maybe reporting it to, like, a particular leader can also lead to, like, peer pressure of, like, them being like, oh, maybe you shouldn't report it, like, you know, so you can't get in trouble. So what do you think about that? And if they do choose to report it to student community standards, like what resources do you provide to help them with that experience?
Yeah, I think that is a great question. I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of report it to student community standards first, because I think one of the things that may happen is that pressure to not, hey, we can handle it internally. Don't report it to the Office of Student Community Standards. But one of the things we try to do as it relates to assist a student with that, because I know a lot of times when students report it, they want to remain anonymous, and we always try through our investigation process. We don't share a lot of information when we're investigating. We'll just say, hey, we got this report, but we have these list of questions based off the report that we received, and we try not to include that individual's name if we can. But we also let a student know, like, there's going to come to a point that if a student, if it gets to the point where there may be allegations of hazing that are substantiated, that information has to be presented to that individual organization so they kind of know. But if it gets to the point where we try to make that person anonymous, we do that as long as we can to protect that student. But I always want students to understand, like, we try to protect you as much as we can, but the accused student or organization also has the right to know who's making these accusations against them as well. So unless there's some other information I'm forgetting, but I think that's kind of how we try to navigate that piece.
So what are some steps that student orgs or sororities, fraternities, what are steps that they can take to prevent hazing from happening now and in the future?
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think just looking at the activities you do. So if there's stuff that the organization's been doing for years and years and years, like, do an annual review of it. Have a conversation. Like, does this still make sense? I mean, we have to do that in business and in work all of the time. Does this still make sense for the population that we're working with, for who we're working with? Does this connect with the core values of our institution or of our organization, have we looked even what our values are and whether those still are meaningful for us in this organization? And so I think it's easy to repeat the things that have been done for years and years and years. And you always, it's like a game of telephone. There's little modifications that happen over the years which get us into, the territory that's not so great. And so how do we sit down and actually have a thoughtful and intentional conversation about what we're doing and why we're doing it? Not just the what, but the why really matters in that. And that's going to help really ground the organization in their purpose.
Right.
I think a lot of times organizations engage in some activities to, like, we want to make sure that our organization is closely connected, or we're bonding. I think one of the things that they can also do is use the resources that we have here at the institution. If you have activities that you want to try, or this is a long-standing tradition that we've always had, but we're questioning what we're actually doing, come to the student conduct office or student community standards and just ask, like, hey, would this be considered hazing? Another thing, I'll give another department a shout out. Student activities, our student organization leadership and development. They're things that you can consult with them to say, hey, we are thinking about doing XYZ. Would this be permitted? Or can you assist us in developing an activity that promotes this? And we'll be able to walk you through the steps of, like, if you do it XYZ or this particular way, this is how you do it where it's not considered hazing. So I think using some resources and staff members that we have here at the institution ahead of time, instead of like after the fact and was like, we thought this would be great, could probably potentially assist organizations in not getting into much into issues as it relates to hazing.
So how does hazing damage the student experience on campus? Kind of a tough question.
Yeah, and I think it's a tough question and a great question all wrapped up in one. But I think one of the things that makes the Aggie experience unique and different from every other experience at a different institution is that we have these core values that that kind of guide us as Aggies as students matriculate through Texas A&M, and hazing goes against those. So if you really just think about the core values of the institution and what our foundation is at the institution, if you think about how hazing can go against that, I think that will guide a student into thinking about how hazing will mold their experience and or have a negative impact on their experience.
Yeah, and I also think it just veers away from the core mission of the institution. When we talk about education and focusing on our coursework and some of the things that fit within that definition of hazing, the sleep deprivation and the physical harm and all of those things make it very difficult for a student to do what they need to do for their courses and those kinds of things. So on a bigger level, in terms of really demonstrating that we're adhering to the core values of the institution, and then also just on an individual level in terms of individual students and what their purpose is here and what they are doing here as a student.
Right. So why do you think it's so hard for students to recognize that they're being hazed and it's hard to speak up about it?
I think one of the main reasons why it's difficult is that students have a want or to belong to an organization, or really is tied to that sense of belonging, and sometimes they feel like if they report or if they get somebody quote unquote in trouble, that it may ostracize them or cause them not to be able to belong here at Texas A&M, and that couldn't be further from the truth. There's
Right.
other ways to get involved. And then you have to really think about, do you want to be involved with an organization that does those type of behaviors? That may be
Right.
something that you really want to consider. But I think one of the things that really prevents that barrier is that sense of belonging and want to be a part of a group is one of the big barriers we see.
Yeah, and I think, I go back to that foot in the door. I'm I'm willing to tolerate these little things in order to have this connection. And then as things escalate, it's like, well, I can take a little bit more.
Right.
Well, I can take a little bit more. And I think too, some of it is that people just haven't even thought about what their boundary is. And so if I don't know where my boundary is, then, oh, well, that's not so bad. Oh, that's not so bad. And then we get to a place where, okay, now it's really bad. But then I start blaming myself too. I'm like, well, I let it get to this place. I consented or acquiesced to get to this place. And so I'm not going to consider it to be hazing. Well, we know the consent and acquiescence is not, a defense. And so I think it's really easy to get into that pattern because of that want to be connected. And I may have wanted to be a part of this organization for years, knowing, and so I'm going to be willing to put up with some things that maybe I don't recognize as being part of this kind of spectrum of hazing or organizational abuse pieces in order to be in that role and to be in that organization and to have that affiliation. And so there's a lot of things that play into that, and it's going to be different for everyone about why that struggle is going to be there.
Right. And I do think like one of the best pieces of advice that you can get and like something that the division really pushes is like obviously creating your own Aggie experience. And like I think people think, oh, maybe I don't like belong here. But like that is like the biggest lie anybody could ever tell you, especially at A&M. There's so much that's offered here. There's so many programs, so many organizations. And I think you just have to tell yourself, like, maybe this org wasn't for me and there is something for me here and I do belong somewhere. And I think, as someone who's been in orgs and like dropped orgs and like finally found my place somewhere, I think it's easy to feel that way, like, oh, I have to do these things so I can belong here. But it's like in reality, like you belong somewhere else and that's okay too.
Right.
So, I don't know. That's just something that I learned from being here. And I think that's great advice to just remember is that, especially if you have to do something to belong somewhere, that's not your place.
For sure.
How can we empower people to say no and stand up against hazing?
I think one of the things that has going to be a reoccurring theme within Hazing Prevention Week is to kind of, stand up and say no. And on Monday, that we had we're doing a party on the plaza where students are going to be able to take that hazing pledge and really get resources related to hazing. We've also had a speaker come to really talk about the dangers of hazing and how it impacted her and her family. And I think once students hear those types of messages and information, I think once they know about the dangers and how it can impact them, we also are going to continue to educate our student population as it relates to how to report and stand up, identify, and be able to report those issues related to hazing. Because I think one of our core strategy as it relates to our hazing prevention team is like just the whole tagline for the week is going to be hazing is bad bull. And also just understanding that that's not the Aggie way.
Right.
So like we're resting on those core values and making sure that students understand that our core values and hazing goes against those. So, and making sure that they understand that and be able to identify them and report it when they see it.
Yeah, and I think too, just remembering that, like, as a student, you deserve to be treated with respect.
Right.
And I think too, like, there's a line of that. So sometimes do you have to be told you're going to have to do a certain kind of thing? Yes. And also, when we see somebody, posting embarrassing photos or those kinds of things, or some of the other things that really are entrenched within the hazing culture, it's about disrespecting somebody ultimately. And we don't always see it that way. But I think it's reminding for yourself, if you're in that situation, that I deserve to be treated with respect. The other piece of that, too, is that you're probably not the only one. And so I've had lots of situations where we've had a group of students come in, a really clear hazing situation that happened, and I talk through with the students who were the receiving end of that behavior. And I ask the question, why didn't you speak up? And it was like, I was afraid to. I didn't want to be the only one who spoke up in that situation. And I was like, there's literally 10 of you who felt like the situation was bad, it was problematic, it was not the right thing. And if one of you had spoken up, it might have empowered other people to also have said something. And so I think when we also talk about leadership, that we can really stand on that too, is how am I a leader in this situation to be able to say, I don't think that this is right, and here are the reasons why I don't think it's right, and being able to ask the question. I think too, when you have a culture that in an organization, we talk about green flags in relationships or positive things in relationships, being able to question things and ask for clarity about why we might be doing something, that's a green flag. That's great. That means that there might be a culture, or there should be a culture, right, that we can have these conversations and that you're going to treat me with respect in that space.
Right. Well, thank you so much to Dr. Bell and Dr. Harrell. This was so informative and so interesting. I think it's important that we talk about this and, the prevention of hazing, and it keeps A&M awesome and the best school in the world, which is great. Yes. For more information on how to get involved through the division, you can go to text.ag/create your Aggie experience. We'll see you guys next time. Thanks, and gig 'em.